This movie begins just like the trailer does. Is that a good or a bad sign? Maybe both. What is up, everybody? RandomRandomMan here. Apologies for not having reviewed anything in a while, seeing that school just recently happened and nothing too interesting was in theaters for a while. Until now, as I am reviewing the film adaptation of The Maze Runner, which stars Dylan O'Brien, Kaya Scardelario, Thomas Brody Sangster, and Will Poulter, and is directed by Wes Ball. Now the plot, which of course is based off of the novel the same name and is written by James Dashner, follows Thomas, played by Dylan O'Brien, who wakes up ascending on an elevator known as the Box into an environment known as the Glade, which is inhabited by a bunch of other boys and is surrounded by a huge maze. And the only way to escape is through said maze. And once Thomas builds up the will to try to escape, he finds out more about why he was sent here. Now, I have not read this book that the movie is based off of, and I was somewhat curious as to the title and concept of this movie, but then again, I was quickly reminded of how much of a growing trend it is in Hollywood today to adapt a young adult science fiction dystopian novel into a movie, as we've already had The Hunger Games, Divergent, and even The Giver, which I felt was more of a mixed bag than anything else. So, I wasn't expecting too much of a variation here, but is this novel worthy of its film adaptation? Let's run down the whole thing. One concern I did have going into this movie was if the main character was going to be as compelling of a lead as some of the other stars in the previous film adaptations that I've mentioned. And thankfully, that is the case here once again, as Dylan O'Brien made for a pretty cool Thomas, as I believed he was as confused and curious as he was supposed to be once he is thrown into the Glade with the other boys. And he really made for a character that I was rooting for throughout and wanted to have him accomplish his goal. And once he did start out and continue through the movie, I was pretty satisfied. The rest of the cast here is as engaging as O'Brien's character, as Thomas Brody Sangster played one of O'Brien's companions with a little bit of a snarky yet cool wisecracking edge towards him. And Will Poulter played another character who was soon at odds with O'Brien's character as to who was right in either staying or leaving the maze. Even some of the extras in this movie were as interesting to follow as our leads, as the filmmakers behind this movie have made a pretty wise decision to showcase a multicultural cast here, right down from who was actually leading the boys to the other characters just lurking in the background, as they had a pretty good presence on screen. My issues with the cast, however, come in when Kaya Scordelario's character is first introduced, and this isn't a spoiler because it is showcased in the trailer, but eventually a girl does ascend up the elevator to join the rest of the boys, and I felt there wasn't much justification as to why she is even there in the first place, other than the fact that she's going to be the only girl in this group full of boys. And even towards the end, there really wasn't much note to be given to why she is even there. Also, there is one actress of great note that I will not name who is also first introduced at the end. And she didn't add much either towards what the rest of the plot was all about, other than the fact that it was going to be a part of the plot that was rushed in towards the end. But even with that, the main cast and some of the other supporting characters that I mentioned were pretty suitable and well-rounded for what this movie was all about from its premise. And it really did make for a pretty colorful cast of characters to follow. In terms of how the plot was handled, I was impressed in how mysterious this premise was, involving a bunch of boys in a secluded area surrounded by nothing but a maze. And once some of these characters are fleshed out, I also really like the sense of community that they built with one another, from the bonds that these characters either built up or broke, or even them scavenging for food and building up shelter. And it was just really interesting to see this be reminiscent of Lord of the Flies, and that is definitely a good thing. Once the maze and its actual purpose are first spotlighted, my attention was still held throughout, as I was fascinated by how these boys were going to scavenge the maze and why some of them stayed back. And once the action in the maze does get going, it is really exhilarating, from the running sequences to the battles with creatures known as grievers who inhabit the maze. And it really does make for a pretty entertaining film for the most part. Yes, I do mean for the most part, as this brings up the biggest issue with the movie, as the first 2/3 really do live up to what this film was billed as. But once the last third starts to roll around and the motivations as to why the boys were stuck in this environment in the first place, the movie goes south really fast. How fast, you may ask? Well, as fast as the last 5 to 10 minutes of this movie could possibly ruin a movie? Yeah, that fast. And I'm not even exaggerating, as this does build up what could be considered sequel territory, as there are more books in this movie series to be covered. At least that's what it's intended to be. And it's not even that I would have had an issue with it unless it was handled better, as the last lines are so cliche and expositional beyond belief that it really did take me out of the movie immensely, especially considering it is within the final minutes, and it makes me less interested in seeing what has happened next, as, hey, you're gonna have to figure out what happens in the sequel. And I really did not want that to happen, but it did, and that really let me down once the movie came to its conclusion. All of this really adds up to a movie that I was really enjoying throughout the first hour and a half or so, since this is a 2-hour movie, but is hampered by its final moments. And I really do not know what to expect going into this franchise, if it is going to turn into a franchise, since the book does have a loyal fan base and it is poised to make the most money this weekend. Of the franchises that were set up this year from books, between this and Divergent, I would much prefer Divergent to be continued, as it will be, as I'm probably in the minority that considered that movie good. But for this one, I did not mind it, but then again, it is nothing too special, but it is enjoyable to an extent, and I will cautiously recommend it. My final thoughts on this movie are that an admirable main cast, a very intriguing story for a movie like this, and some satisfying action barely save what it summed up to be in the end. I don't know if the ending to this movie was at all related to its source material, but regardless or not, if it was, I really think that it needed some reworking behind the scenes before the final cut. But as it currently stands, fans of this book series may as well enjoy it, given that it is a pretty strong loyalty that they have to the series. But as for everyone else, the first 2/3 of this movie really do have some value that warrants a viewing. Just don't expect the ending to be as strong as what this movie was building up to be in the first place. My final verdict for The Maze Runner is 3 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of The Maze Runner, subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review.